Thanks very much. Thanks, Christina. Um, so this is the first ever talk I've given on rewilding, and it was a particularly difficult one for me to write, I found. I didn't expect it to be so challenging, and I tried to pin down why I felt it was challenging for me. And I came up with two reasons, which thankfully I managed to spin into advantages for the talk in the end. So the first reason was that I was never quite sure while writing this what people mean by rewilding and whether they mean a sort of post-apocalyptic scenario where humans have just vanished from the planet and nature in some magical way recovers, or whether rewilding is allowed to include some level of management so that humans can be allowed to coexist with nature in some sense. Um, so that was my first source of confusion, and I settled it by saying that rewilding can be any point on a sliding scale between those two, and I was really glad that James accepted that point of view. My second source of discomfort was that I decided to sort of talk about four different case studies where I think rewilding is relevant. And at the end of the talk, I felt that these four different components felt quite disconnected. And I convinced myself that these cracks are the places where theory can really step in and have a good bridging effect. So having said this, I want to introduce this with some structure by kind of overturning perhaps the sort of more hippie-esque idea about rewilding in the sense that nature has a natural balance to which it will only tend if we leave it alone. I think the sort of public perception of rewilding contains notions like the sort of balance of nature, sort of pristine ecosystems and returning back to pristine ecosystems, and even perhaps worse, the idea that if you leave nature alone, it will return to this sort of unique, pristine condition. But there's two lessons from theory that we have for dynamical systems. The first one is that complex systems can have multiple equilibria, and some of those will by default be unstable. And the second one is that even if we're dealing with a sort of stable outcome, it may take time for a system to reach it. And very often when we're thinking about data, we need to recognize that we're looking at systems very often in transient states. Especially when the world is changing all the time, it's possible that we catch our systems in permanently transient states. So what I decided to do was to structure my talk around these two concepts of multiple equilibria and transient states with two examples in each. And having thought about it for a while, it occurs to me that when we're talking about the mathematics of rewilding, there's three areas where mathematics can be really, really helpful. The first one is in formulating models, translating our conceptual models into mathematical models, and trying to get some intuition, some theoretical intuition about what mathematics does so well, thinking about steady states and dynamics. I think this first bullet point actually has increasing relevance for the second bullet point of statistical inference, where mathematics, of course, comes in developing efficient methods for doing inference, but it also comes in providing us computational shortcuts through the introduction of mathematical solutions from the first category. So if, for example, we want to fit a fairly sophisticated dynamical model to real data, then having insights about the sort of analytical properties of that system is also helpful in fitting that model to data. And finally, in terms of applications of those, there's a lot for mathematics to do in trying to optimize our management if we assume that some human management is permitted under the sort of rewilding banner. So for this talk, I'll talk about two fairly disconnected examples on steady states, a single species one and a community one. So hopefully connecting a little bit to the sort of catastrophe ideas that James was talking about previously. And I'll think a little bit about transient states from field studies and from experimental studies, and all the while thinking about the mathematical models, the statistical ways of bringing those models closer to data, and wherever relevant, ideas of optimization. So the first example, which looks at single species steady states, is motivated from this general area that's very much in vogue when we're talking about conservation of species distribution modeling. So species distribution modeling in ecology is really a booming industry. There's hundreds of papers, thousands of papers coming on not just describing species distributions, but also predicting species distributions under, for example, climate change or human disturbance. So we're thinking about range expansions, range contractions, and so on and so forth. At the same time as this category of models is seeing a sort of rapid development, we have sort of counter arguments about their uncontrolled application for determining how our actions on the environment might affect species distributions and abundances, particularly on this keyword of transferability. Transferability is a pretty poisonous word for these models because it implies that their predictions really do not transfer across space and time, which begs the question, what good are they if what we really want to be doing is to anticipate what a species will do in the future when conditions have changed. So I want to sort of talk a little bit about why this happens and how we can try to address it. The reason why this happens is that we have tended to identify what we see with what underlies what we see in ecology. So what we see is the distribution of species across space and across habitats, which traditionally ecologists have tended to think of as the realized niche of a species. What underlies this is the fitness that's associated with habitats and the preferences that animals in particular display towards different types of habitat, which ecologists have tended to think of as the fundamental niche. Now, the fundamental niche is supposed to be eminently transferable because it describes something about the essence, the needs, the requirements, and the responses of an organism, whereas the realized niche is something that's fairly moldable and fairly changeable depending on the circumstances that a species finds itself in. And in between the fundamental niche and the realized niche, we have a huge amount of biological machinery that cannot possibly be described by the statistical models that we tend to use for capturing species distributions. So essentially what we tend to do without often recognizing it is that we identify fitness with distribution and essentially crossing out all the intervening biology and pretending that where we see loads of species or where the abundance of a particular species is quite high, that's obviously a place that's quite good for it. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we've convinced ourselves that this could be thought of as a null model in this particular area of spatial ecology. And we know that null models in every area of science have been really quite fruitful, assuming that you start developing those into more realistic versions and see how the insights you get from these null models develop accordingly. So I would like to sort of think a little bit in this first part of the talk about the fundamental niche and how it can help us towards getting more transferability, in other words, getting more predictive power across space and time, so we can anticipate these future equilibria, if you like, these future distributions of a particular species under new environmental makeups. So the way that the sort of originator of the fundamental niche, Evelyn Hutchinson, or at least this version of the fundamental niche, introduced it was as this part of environmental space, a sort of multidimensional space made up of environmental conditions that gives individuals of a species positive fitness and allows populations of the species to grow. And the way that ecology textbooks visualize this kind of thing is in terms of tolerances. So you can survive within a range of temperatures, which can be generalized in multiple dimensions, so that you have these sort of hypercubes in n-dimensional space that contain the viability of the species, and anywhere inside that hypervolume, the species survives and grows. Everywhere outside it dies. You don't have to be so deterministic about it. You can be a little bit fuzzier, so you can have probabilistic definitions of these volumes. But crucially, you need to move this up to generalize it to a sort of packing of species in environmental space, where multiple species push and nudge each other into realized niches within communities. I'll come back to that later on. Now, if we start from this very fundamental idea, taking an exponential growth model to begin with, then the sort of rate of growth of this population, and it doesn't matter if it's in discrete time or not, is typically described as the exponential of some function of things. And that function of things can conveniently be thought of as the fitness or the average fitness of the population. Now, the subscript X in this is habitat. So you can think of X as the collection of environmental variables to which this particular organism responds. In the simplest sense possible, then, we can define the fundamental niche as a subset of environmental space such that the fitness of the organism is non-negative, which allows an intrinsic growth rate, R, that leads to the growth of the population. At this point, we're not really interested in density dependence or any sort of saturating responses, because the definition of the fundamental niche talks specifically about the capability of a species to take hold in a particular area. So it's the intrinsic growth rate that we're really interested in. The problem with this definition is that it looks at a particular location and ignores a lot of the complexities that are associated with how individuals might experience space by, for example, moving and achieving a positive fitness by commuting between food and cover and other resources, by combining different options that are available to them in space. So in the next slide, I'll present what usually takes about an hour to sort of motivate, but I'll try and go through it just to convince you with the ceremonial mathematics that there is some substance, some quantitative substance to this. So starting from the sort of general definition of the niche, what I would propose as a more generalized idea is to say, well, let's think about a sort of context-specific fitness, where we define fitness in terms of the focal habitat that you're standing in just now, but giving you the ability to experience your surrounding world, so that you have these options of combining different habitats that might be in proximity to the one that you're standing on just now. If we want to make this a little bit more biologically meaningful, we could say that the habitat that you're standing in right now could be the habitat at the centroid, say, of your home range. And we're interested in the context within which you're existing. So not just the habitat you're standing in, but what's around you as well. So we could think of that context-specific fitness in terms of the sort of integral across environmental space of three things. F of Z is the localized fitness that you can extract from any given habitat. WZ given X is the choices that you make across the habitats Z, given that you're standing at habitat X. And FZ given X is the availability of different habitat Z, given that you're standing at habitat X. And these three components that integrate to give this context-specific fitness can be broken up into individual models. The sort of habitat-specific fitness can be written as a linear predictor of environmental covariates in some coefficients beta. The habitat availability, I'm not going to go into the description of this expression, but essentially the habitat availability is a probabilistic model that tells you what you're likely to be encountering in your environment, given the structure of the environment, i.e. the spatial autocorrelation between within different characteristics of the environment, and your mobility. So how self-similar is the environment around you, and how fast do you move covering distances? This determines what kind of habitats you're likely to encounter given that you're standing at habitat X. And finally, habitat selection captures the complex behavior of choice that organisms make. This looks like, again, a sort of log linear model with a linear predictor, but that linear predictor has varying coefficients, gamma, to allow the habitat selection to be made in response to the entire menu of available choices, rather than to the availability of any one habitat type in particular. So if this made any sense at all, then I'm really glad, because it wasn't really supposed to make a lot of sense, but I'm very happy to engage in conversation later on about this. The main point, though, that comes out of this is that behavior, complex environmental heterogeneity, and contributors to fitness are all folded into an expression of context-specific fitness, which can then be set to 0 in order for us to find, if you like, the surface of this manifold that makes up the fundamental niche. So 0 is the point where fitness sort of delineates between the interior and the exterior of the fundamental niche, and it takes into account, given a reference habitat X, all nearby habitat-specific contributions of fitness, weighted by their availability and the preferential usage that a complex organism might apply to those. And the key thing is that this whole model has a closed form solution, at least for the sort of exponential functions that I showed you in the previous slide. So these exponential functions are judiciously selected to make sure that we can solve this, or at least we can write this in an integral free form. Now, then the motivation for doing this is in getting to a point where you can do statistical inference on this kind of model. And let me show you how this might be done. Let's say that we now bring a model into this, which includes density dependence, and that we rewrite this model in a form that incorporates our fitness expression from the previous slide with some attrition, that's the beta NT term, to account for density dependence. So that's crowding as opposed to Ali effects. Now, it turns out that because the expressions in the previous slide have closed form solutions, this can be rewritten stochastically as a sort of some sort of stochastic model. It doesn't have to be a Poisson, in which the contents of the linear predictor and the exponential are written in terms of constructed covariates phi, which inherit the properties of spatial structuring of the environment, behavioral choice inside of them, and the regression coefficients that get left out in this model are essentially the coefficients of fitness that are latent and until this kind of work not really estimable. And there's a beta coefficient there to describe the sort of attrition from density dependence. The whole point of this is that because you can calculate all of these constructed covariates phi analytically from things that are estimable readily in the previous models, you can actually then derive a fairly simple GLM-like model for predicting population growth and population size based on all these complexities of habitat structuring, organism behavior, mobility, and so on and so forth. So very quickly show you an example of an application of this framework to a real species, looking at sparrow populations, different colonies living in suburbia, experiencing different structuring of sort of environments depending on the makeup of the gardens of the people living within the home ranges of those sparrows. The details of this are fairly expansive, but the point is that if you try to anticipate how populations will grow, given the makeup of their environment, this kind of model can do a really good job of anticipating their growth, both in terms of fitting the data well, but also in terms of predicting the growth of populations that it hasn't really seen before. It just sees the composition of their environment. From a theoretical perspective, the sort of insights that you can get from a model like this are quite interesting. So this was a specification of this general sparrow model down to a very, very simple scenario where we were just looking at 3 environmental characteristics, just for the aid of visualization, and just one source of heterogeneity, so one parameter controlling heterogeneity in all 3 of those. And we calculated the fundamental niche in this very trivial situation by looking at the presence and the absence of heterogeneity and choice in these organisms. And what you find is that even though this is a very simple situation, the parameters that are involved in this model have been estimated from the real system. What you find is that in a homogeneous environment, so if the entire home range of the sparrows is basically a soup of resources that's completely equally spread, you get this kind of shape. If you allow heterogeneity and choice, so that there's aggregations of good stuff and aggregations of bad stuff, and the animals have the option to choose between those, they can effectively, through behavior and space use, inflate their viable space in a very predictable and very measurable way. And I think the key achievement here is that all of these parameters are estimable from observed data. Final slide on this is to do with this optimization idea, where I think a lot of really good spatial mathematics could happen. In a sort of toy example, what we thought we'd do was to optimize the kind of garden compositions that for any given colony would give the best possible growth rate, subject to constraints. So the constraints were that you would not ask people to demolish their houses in order to create sparrow habitat, but other than that, you could play around with the things in garden architecture that are playable. And for the 12 sparrow colonies that we looked at, we found that under this model, we could actually, in some cases, achieve considerable increases in the viability of the colonies, in many cases taking colonies from negative growth rates to positive growth rates by rearranging or altering some types of habitat for others. So I'm really looking forward to more realistic types of optimization, which factor in sort of constraints about the arrangement of or the possible arrangement of different habitat types. So the lessons from this, I think, is that the fundamental niche, which is considered a fairly intractable entity, may be mathematically and statistically tractable. It definitely improves the transferability of models, so it increases our predictive power, and it gives us the ability for a single species at least to say, tell me what the makeup of the environment of that species is going to be, and I can tell you what the growth rate and the carrying capacity of that population is going to be as a result. So in other words, we can write growth rate and population capacity in terms of exact environmental structuring. It would be nice, though, really important, to take this kind of idea to the multiple species system, so that we're talking about communities. And in order to do this, in my next example, I've essentially dropped the habitat composition and nuances of habitat selection. You don't have to do this, but this is where we could really have a useful conversation about theory. How do we sort of carry all these features with us? So to look at communities, we looked at agri-environmental scheme, or the idea of cacao plantations, which can be developed to any extent from fully intensive and systematic to semi-wild sort of agroforests. And we started from a stochastic population model, very similar to the one that I was talking about before, for each one of the populations in the community. We used a sort of fairly familiar Lotka-Volterra sort of connectivity between those species, and we wrote the growth rate of any given population in terms of covariates, including tools for land management. So the kind of tools that I'm talking about are either applying pesticides or regulating the degree of shade, the growth of the trees within those plantations. So by putting those covariates into the model, we're allowing at least some levers to explore management actions once this model has been fitted. And the whole idea was to fit this model to data rather than to just simulate from it, and then to look at the equilibria of the system to try and understand what the system will do given some sort of management actions. Now, I should say...
Sorry, can I interrupt, Jason?
Yes.
Can you just go back a slide? I missed it. So what do those different variables mean? No, the slide with all the formulae on it. So what are N and L and X, please?
Apologies. So N are different populations, so different population sizes. X are environmental variables. A are trophic connectivity parameters that essentially determine the growth of any given species in terms of the abundance of other species, and other species can have positive or negative influences on any given focal species. And B determines the growth rate of this focal ith population. Does that make more sense?
Yes, thank you. So I mean, in your example, these would be different trees. Oh, this is trees and insects interacting, is it? Or
there we go.
Oh.
So I'm not going to go into the way that the data were necessarily collected or analyzed so that they can be brought into this, but essentially the data set that was used to this were snippets of population change for different species within the system, not necessarily all of them. And there was replication in space so that different plantations operating under different management regimes were observed and included so that we could extract information about the effect of the covariates. So I wanted to just say before we move on this kind of model that there have been some really great insights for 40 years or more on these types of models that could have really valuable uses in management if we could kind of translate these insights into practical rules of thumb. So for example, this analysis here concludes that depending on the type of perturbation that you have on a system, whether it's a pulse or a press perturbation, you stand to learn more about different aspects of that system. So pulse perturbations tend to tell you more about the growth rate, the intrinsic growth rate of different populations, whereas press perturbations tend to tell you more about carrying capacities. And I think revisiting those kinds of insights becomes especially relevant for inference. If you're designing a sort of an experimental plan where you want to have balance of information coming in for different phases of that system, it's good to consider what kind of perturbations you fold into your data collection so that the data set is informative enough for the model to be fitted to. I think it's a really nice example of where theory that was developed before computer-intensive model fitting was a thing could be revisited usefully to help with modern techniques. So anyway, back to this example. We fitted the sort of this multi-species model to the combination of the data from different years and from different places. And I just want to show you some visuals of the kinds of results that you might get for this in describing the long-term behavior of this system. So this is very similar to the plots that James presented. The only difference is that these plots aren't constructed directly from observations, but from estimated trophic connectivities between the components of the system. So that's the bit on the left. The bit on the right splits the sort of equilibria between two scenarios. A very intensive 10% shade scenario where trees are short and thinned out and spaced regularly, and a 90% shade scenario where we're talking more about a forest situation. And the sort of key thing I want to show is that the emergent properties regarding pests in this system indicate a lowering of the abundance of pests to the plantation product as a result of a less intensive management scheme. So essentially, we're looking at the possibility that farmers can produce more cacao in these plantations by a less intensive kind of operation through indirect effects, essentially increasing the number of birds in the system, which then suppress insect pests in the system. We can look at other things, such as, for example, the interaction between natural and non-natural intervention. So each one of those panels gives you a scenario which is a combination between the sort of, if you like, the rewilding lever of letting the plantation be closer to a forest from left to right, and from bottom to top, the intensity of pesticide that could be applied to the system. And you could kind of look at various sort of interesting features of this, such as, for example, that you completely annihilate forest birds very quickly with pesticides, and you give them some refuge by a level of rewilding in this case, or that you can have no benefits by applying high degrees of pesticide in forested plantations, if that's the strategy you've chosen to follow. So I think these insights can become particularly informative, especially given that they're based on fitted parameters. So they're originating from data. They're not kind of just plausible parameters plugged in. So the key lesson from this for me was that we could surprisingly fit this model to data, even though there weren't long time series. We sort of relied on space for time substitution, and we were able to look at fairly complex management rewilding scenarios by then putting those fitted models to sort of questions of choice. It would be good to understand how long the system will take to get to those states and start to think about sort of transients. And to do that, for the next step, I will just think, rather than thinking about community compositions, I'll think about summaries of communities, like biodiversity summaries. I think that's a sacrifice. I would much rather have the full community to work from. And to think about sort of transient states, as in the first instance, I want to talk about extinction debts and colonization credits in this variable of biodiversity. Species richness for now, but we have done some additional work looking at functional biodiversity with some interesting results that I'm not going to present. Now, landscape change is a fact. So is climate change. So things are changing. The makeup and the composition of habitats and landscapes is changing all the time. And we need to consider two things. The first one is that some species may already be condemned to extinction following environmental changes that happened years ago. And second, that not all places that are suitable are necessarily instantaneously occupied. So there may be suitable habitat that may temporarily appear vacant. The risk of ignoring those sort of transient behaviors is that we might be too optimistic. So we might ignore the effects of deaths on biodiversity, and we might think we're doing really great in terms of management and conservation. The flip side is that we might waste opportunities. So we might ignore the effects of credits and miss the importance of apparently unoccupied but really suitable vital habitats. So we tried in a joint work to look at the possibility of capturing those delays and retrieving the underlying equilibria that are hiding from us due to the fact that the systems are always in transit. So we felt that different times and different places offer contrast, context, and replication, and we should aim to use them for modeling and inference. As a response variable, we could think of single species abundance or multi-species abundance, or as in this case, biodiversity. We assume that the system is heading towards an attractive but unobserved equilibrium, which can be written down as a function of environmental covariance and fixed parameters. And we assume that the system travels towards the current equilibrium, that the model describing the equilibrium is stationary in space and time, conditional on the covariates that we're giving it. And we allow for the possibility that the system is caught somewhere in between the past and future equilibrium. So the environment has changed, the system is moving, and what we want to do is essentially to think about the sort of idea of chasing ghosts, where the ghost in this case is the latent equilibrium that the system wants to go towards, but Pac-Man is the system itself trying to go after that equilibrium. So as the system approaches some sort of notional equilibrium, we change the environment, the equilibrium moves away, and the system tries to move towards it until we observe it. And if we think about this sort of fairly caricature scenario in more ways than one, what we did in this particular example was to think of the state of the system as a mixture of the equilibrium it's coming from and the equilibrium it's going to. We can have a lot of discussion about how realistic this is, but that's what we did anyway. So we essentially wrote the state of the system as some stochastic process whose expectation is given as a mixture between the equilibrium in the future, the equilibrium in the past, so future being T2, past being T1, with a mixing coefficient, the function omega, both of those written in terms of environmental covariance, and some potentially additive instantaneous effects in the function G. So the task of this was to find the parameters of the red model that quantify the underlying equilibria subject to covariance, and also find the mixing or the parameters for the mixing function omega that tells us how slowly the system is responding to this particular type of change. Now, the equilibrium could be written as a sort of linear predictor, or it could include some more interactions. In this case, F is the sort of equilibrium that the system is headed towards, and X are the environmental variables that define the composition of the landscape. A similar sort of idea was applied to the lag model, where we specified it in terms of the magnitude of change that was instigated on different aspects of the environment. So essentially, the coefficients gamma that are to be estimated from this model tell us how rapidly the system is able to adapt to a particular environmental change. So if we're thinking about urbanization, for example, so how quickly does the system move from its past to its future equilibrium when urbanization increases or declines? We applied this sort of framework to a very large data set, the North America Breeding Bird Survey, and we applied it to the sort of landscape changes that have happened across the United States over the last sort of few decades. And what you see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of habitat that we sort of focused on in terms of land use. And the different colors indicate increases or declines in these types of habitat. After having fitted the model and having applied the predictions of the model across the landscape based on these landscape changes, what we found was that 52% of the United States is expected to lose species, and 48% is expected to gain species into the future. And these expected losses and gains are not entirely randomly distributed across space, and they're localized around metropolitan areas, for example, in the case of deaths. We found that the scale of change was really quite large. We could gain or lose up to 30 species in any given location, and neglecting these deaths and credits could lead to severe overestimates of the effective number of species that a landscape can support. Now, the similar results with more interesting features appear when you start looking at functional biodiversity. But as I said, these are very new results. In terms of temporal results, this very strange plot shows you how slowly a species can adapt to particular changes in different habitats. So if we take this particular example here on wetland change, for example, on the right we're looking at increase in wetland, on the left we're looking at decrease in wetland, and the curve here is essentially the mixing coefficient that determines where you're caught between the present and the past. So 1 means you're completely caught in the past, so you've never had a chance to escape from the past. 0 means your change was instantaneous. And of course, the smaller the change was, the easier it is for the organisms or for biodiversity to respond. So instantaneous change comes when the habitat has been altered very little. But what's interesting about this is to see that increases and declines are characterized by different rates of adaptation, and also different landscape types generate different levels of lag and different levels of uncertainty around these lags than other habitat types. So lessons from this, it appears that lags both in debits and credits are widespread. It would be nice if we, instead of talking about sort of these mixing coefficients, if we could actually obtain detailed transition curves by using purpose-built rewilding experiments, so we can learn exactly how these transitions happen. And the sacrifice for this in the next example is that we're going to drop spatial and temporal breadth and look at some very localized experiments. And the experiments, this is probably the closest thing that I have to a rewilding story in this talk, happened with the addition of this sort of mega herbivore in various aspects, in various places in Scotland, under sort of an experimental design. So this breed of feral ponies was looked at some detail by Debbie, who's also in the audience here. And she specifically looked at the capability of these horses to increase biodiversity with their particular type of grazing and particular type of coexistence with other grazers like sheep. So the hypothesis here was that these animals, once introduced to grassland, can increase the biodiversity of plants. I'm not going to have time to go over this model in detail. All I'm going to say is that we wrote down a model that was capable to capture the effects on biodiversity, a Shannon index in this case, of removing the horses from a particular location or introducing the horses to a particular location. The experimental design included sites where the horses were always present and stayed present, sites where the horses was nearby sites where the horses were absent and stayed absent, places where the horses were absent and were introduced, and places where the horses were present and were removed. And what we wanted from inference on these data were estimates of those two asymptotes, the sort of above and below plateaus of biodiversity, in the absence and the presence of the horses, but crucially the rates of decline and increase, which were allowed to be different, following removal or addition of the ponies. So for me, having this kind of inferential framework is really quite useful in making sense of these experimental data, because things just don't happen instantaneously, and we didn't really have an off-the-shelf tool for trying to make these estimates. So there's 4 different experiments here: introduction, removal, absence, and presence, for all plants and for flowering plants. And the model captures an increase in biodiversity in the case of the introduction of the horses, and within the timescale of Debbie's PhD, doesn't really capture effects on biodiversity of the removal of the horses. I'll also say that the sort of distance between the high and the low plateau was reasonably small, was actually quite small compared to the noise around the data. So it felt that it felt good to be able to look at some actual impacts of on biodiversity of rewilding, even though the effects of rewilding were relatively small and quite noisy. It would be good to develop these models as solutions from differential equations derived from first principles, rather than the sort of heuristic model that I failed to have the time to explain to you in the previous slide. I'm not sure we need to sacrifice anything more at this point. I could run through this talk going backwards, and it would probably make a lot more sense as the mechanistic content of these models increased towards the beginning. So in terms of the sort of my final slide on conclusions, I think these are things that are perhaps fairly obvious to everybody but me, but I'll just put those up for discussion anyway. I think that this idea of multiple stable states, the emphasis being on multiple and transience, the dynamics, should be at the heart of how we define rewilding and how we deal with it. I think it's the only real way to make progress, and I think a lot was said already in the previous talk about this. I think also acknowledging that equilibria are going to never be visible to us. They're always going to be latent, and the observations are going to come from transient system. It's a good start to start correcting biases in the models that we develop. I can talk about this for another hour, on the particular type of biases that lags can create. On the other hand, relaxing the pseudo-equilibrium assumptions that a lot of models, such as species distribution models, make is a really good way to start introducing mechanism back into statistical models, where we think about the determinants of the sort of carrying capacities that we're trying to model. Measuring and understanding and predicting the impacts of rewilding confronts us with trade-offs between mechanism and statistical convenience, that I think could be addressed analytically. If we could solve some of these models analytically, then we could fit them more easily statistically. And finally, I think that abstractions such as biodiversity are very difficult to build intuition around, at least for me. But if we derived behaviors for biodiversity from the emergent properties of perhaps more mechanistic models, then perhaps we'll have shortcuts to derive rules of thumb that we can pass on to decision makers for designing management policies and priorities. Sorry if these are somewhat vague, but that's the end of my talk.